Bonjour and happy Tuesday. We are coming to you live from Paris on the ground at the World Satellite Business Week. You could call it Pathfinder in Petty. Joining us for the first installment of Pathfinder in Petty is Caleb Henry, a senior analyst at Quilty Analytics. Quilty is a satellite and space sector research, investment banking, and strategic advisory boutique shop. Almost nailed it on the first try. Caleb is also a reformed space journalist, and he has not only an encyclopedic knowledge of all things space, but he's quick on his feet and he's able to conjure up some colorful space analogies for us. I'm looking forward to taking you through some of those, and we'll do that right after a word from today's sponsor. Our reliance on satellites for navigation, communications, commerce, and intelligence has grown exponentially in the new space economy. Unfortunately, the risks have grown as well, and the need to prioritize cybersecurity around space assets is critical. SpiderOak Mission Systems provides space cybersecurity products for military, commercial, and civilian operators. Their Orbit Secure solution is the first to deliver zero-trust security to zero-gravity environments, protecting space communication, command, control, data transmission, storage, and integrity at the data level. To learn more about Orbit Secure, check out their website at spideroak-ms.com. Now, before we dive in, there is no discussion of Apple iPhone 14s and Globalstar satellites because we aren't fortune tellers. And this episode was in fact not taped in Petty. It was taped on August 31st, and the Apple event happened after that. But there's plenty of good stuff in this, and I think you're going to love it. Without further ado, Caleb Henry. Caleb, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We are overdue for a catch-up because the last time we chatted was sometime in the summer last year, I believe, of last year. We hadn't even launched the daily newsletter, so we've got a lot to discuss today. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's been a little bit.
That it has. So I just read your high-level intro, but for readers, I always do that, for listeners who might be unaware, what was your last experience before Quilty? And don't worry, we will get into Quilty. I want to talk about that too.
Sure. Yeah. So I spent essentially 7 years as a journalist. I spent 4 years at Space News, 3 years at Via Satellite, and really spent the bulk of my time covering, honestly, parts of the space industry that before I got into, I didn't know would count as space. I think when the average person thinks of space, they're not thinking about satellite TV or satellite internet or flat panel antennas or whatever it is. But then you get into the sector and it's like all anyone's talking about, things like that. So it was sort of an interesting journey. I kind of came in as I'd say your classic space nerd. I knew NASA, I knew ESA. I thought I was special because I knew SpaceX and Blue Origin. And then I got into here and it just kind of like blew the doors off the hinges.
Yeah.
There's so much more going on, and it's really great.
Did you intentionally pursue that route when you were in college? Were you cognizant of the fact that you wanted to wed these two, this interest and passion for space and, writing, journalism?
No, I actually hated writing growing up. It was my least favorite thing, much more preferred math. But I was also a terrible procrastinator. And so my math grades, my math grades suffered because I would do the homework a day late, be like, well, it wasn't interesting. So, it was just too easy. So I didn't really apply myself. And I don't know, it was a weird kind of circuitous path where I ended up going and studying political science and astronomy as the two. There, the math was plenty hard. And then the writing was actually about stuff that was interesting to me. And I think what I learned was when it was more interesting, then I could be more engaged. And I kind of fell backwards into the world of space journalism because I was looking at a way to wed those two interests or skill sets that I had developed in college, and found opportunities in writing about the space industry. And I was thinking, I know a little bit about this, and it turned out I knew a very little bit about it. But over the course of writing, for several years, I think I got to get a much better grasp of it, and it never lost its luster as being something that was interesting to report on and cover.
Yeah, well, there's nothing like daily deadlines and the demands of the space news cycle to just hammer that knowledge into you. But I share that view and experience that you just start to realize how much you don't know the more you get into it.
Mm-hmm. And you can't be a procrastinator anymore.
Yeah,
when,
exactly.
You've got a daily deadline.
Exactly. This is true. This is true. Did you ever have designs on becoming an aerospace engineer? And I ask because, this question lands pretty close to home. It's a story of Mo, our CEO, who ended up doing, similar to yourself, doing a lot of equity research and working on Wall Street with the space industry. And he had initially wanted to be an aerospace engineer. I'm not sure how long it lasted, but then took this circuitous nonlinear path, which is a running theme of the Pathfinder podcast, and still stumbled, or maybe landed a little bit more intentionally still in space.
So for me, it wasn't engineering. I actually really wanted to get into astronomy. I was fascinated very early on by the planets, especially. And maybe I'll tip this back just to give a shout out to the best one.
Love it.
But now it's in the cool. All right. So yeah, Jupiter was my favorite planet. I remember getting a telescope as a kid, and the first thing I did was swivel it to the brightest star, or what I thought was a star in the sky. And I was like, am I going to burn my eyes out doing this? And then I look into it, and I could see the faint stripes of said planet, and it was just my fascination. So I really thought that was going to be the field, but I think during high school, my interest sort of ran wild with all manner of different sciences and just learning in general. I'm just the kind of person that really loves to learn. And as other interests rose, I think space kind of fell to the background for a while. And it wasn't until, getting into the first year or so into college that I really settled on okay, it's going to be space. The school that I'm going to only has the minor, but I'm going to make the most of that. And in the meantime, I'm also going to study other interests and kind of figure it out on the back end, which, college guidance counselor really had no clue what to do with me. Just kind of looked at my transcript and was like, all right, you're passing. So
there you go.
Good.
There you go. Well, I'm going to make a pretty non-graceful transition here, but I think it's clear, quite the Renaissance man, from astronomy and the sciences to investment banking, or investment banking adjacent work, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to now, and tell us about your position, senior analyst at Quilty Analytics, and tell us about what the firm does.
Yeah, so my job today is basically writing reports on companies and topics and technologies within the space industry. So Quilty Analytics is more or less split into two halves. There's an investment banking half that you mentioned, which helps with all those sorts of deals and kind of facilitating M&A deals in the industry. And then there's the research half, which is where I am, and that involves covering reports. And we sort of split them into, I'd say, 4 different buckets. One is fast news analysis. So our last piece was on the SpaceX T-Mobile announcement, and kind of the implications from a competitive stance on what it means to have yet another player entering the direct satellite to cell phone space. We have other reports that are on specific publicly traded companies like Iridium and Viasat and Hughes, where we kind of go into their quarterly earnings each time and try to paint a picture of what, a very detailed picture of how a company is doing in the industry, what's their goals, how are they hitting those goals, and what are the big macro trends, what impact are those having on them. Third would be thematic, which is, we've got different lines. We started one on Earth observation, this year. So we did like a whole report on commercial weather companies, and then we did one on the synthetic aperture radar space and how the number of players there has doubled. Why, what's going to happen next. And our next one actually is going to be on the very high resolution imagery sector. So companies that are flying optical imaging satellites with 50 centimeter resolution or less, and how that's changing the geospatial sector.
Does that include local Austin company? It's what's the reverse?
Yeah, Albedo on our radar for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think I'm glad that you sort of walked through the separation of church and state. I know that I kept mentioning investment banking, but for me personally, I consume those reports. Like that's the way that I interface with Quilty. And unless Payload is IPOing, like I don't think we would interface very much with the other half of the business, and it's premature to say the least to consider an IPO for us. And also, I can't stress enough. It's it's top notch, super quality research and reports. What is the most recent? What's the most recent report that you yourself had a big part in putting out?
It would be the SpaceX T-Mobile one that we just issued on Monday.
Yeah.
Honestly, at this point, it's like Chris Quilty and I, we work together to write basically every report that comes out the door here. My fingerprints are on everything.
Well, Caleb, you teed me up. What are your reactions to Thursday's announcement? And it's always interesting, to see these sorts of events that break out of the space bubble and reach general public consciousness. Maybe not definitely not most of the general public, but like people who are not, eating, breathing, sleeping space every day. A lot of them were aware that this happened.
When you get big names, I think T-Mobile is recognizable to plenty of people. You can start to bring them in and say, hey, here's what's going on in the space sector. And then it's also an easy segue into like, hey, here's how space is going to impact your life. Because, a lot of people, this is an ongoing mantra within the industry. We love to talk about how important we are to everybody and what we do. But, it's a clear way of showing that to people that this is, the goal is hopefully this will improve your quality of life and further, humanity's presence in the cosmos at the same time.
Did you think that it was going to be direct to cell, or did you think it was going to be cellular backhaul? Like, what did Caleb personally, what were you predicting?
I thought cellular backhaul. Yeah, because of the way that SpaceX was talking, or Elon was talking at Mobile World Congress in Spain. I think during his last big talk with mobile network operators, it looked very much like it was going to be kind of a continuation of that kind of service. So for them to announce a direct to cell phone connectivity, and for that to mean a pretty radical redesign of the Starlink satellite. I know they were already working on Gen 2, but to add a massive antenna, I think
big antenna. Yeah.
The thing that is a big talking point in the whole direct to phone conversation is, in order to pick up cellular signals, the cell phone itself is pretty weak. The signal is faint, which means you need like a really powerful antenna, or like ear, essentially, as Elon called it, to be able to hear all of that in space, and then be able to get back and send a signal all the way back to the ground to like a really small, unspecialized device.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on how this affects companies like AST SpaceMobile or Link? Like, do you think that SpaceX and T-Mobile, with this technology partnership, and I want to emphasize that it's a technology partnership rather than like a formal product announcement, but what do you think, what effects does this have on them, if any?
Sure. Well, the first effect, which those companies have been quick to say, is it validates their approach. It proves that this isn't just something that a handful of startups are pursuing, just within this industry. It's something that's increasingly being recognized as, a real game changer if it actually works. This has the potential to be the largest addressable market for the satellite industry. I think before, once upon a time, that was satellite TV. You could connect millions of homes that way. Now, the discussion in terms of largest markets, probably consumer broadband, if you can get the technology right. And then, this one would be huge, and it in many ways parallels satellite TV, because you kind of look back at the old kind of rivalry almost between like cable and satellite, and the fear that the cable guys had was, we could spend all this money, build all this fiber, link this entire city, spend years doing it. They can launch one satellite and connect the whole continent.
Yeah.
Here it's all right, so you've got all your cell towers, and of course you're still going to need your towers and all that infrastructure, but you can put up X number of satellites and boom, you can connect people right where they are. You don't have to have a full bunch of intermediate infrastructure. So from that perspective, it's huge. So good news for AST, Link, and potentially others from the an elevation perspective.
Are there any others that you would call out?
So Iridium has a agreement to.
Yep.
They haven't announced their partner, but they are also working on getting their tech embedded directly in smartphones. And everybody is waiting on the big Apple announcement.
That's right. Seeing
whether or not next week they're going to announce a agreement with Globalstar. That's the speculation. At least 5 players being tracked here, and honestly wouldn't be surprised if there are more as time goes on. Again, if it's a big market, if the technology proves itself out, there's no reason not to expect more players to get into it.
Yeah, we actually ran a Q&A today in the newsletter with Charles Miller, who's the CEO of Link, and that's one aspect that he commented on, is the total addressable market for like fixed wireless or like boats or airplanes. I think he said, and I don't know if this number's super up to date, but like 3 million subscriptions, whereas there's 5 billion smartphones. Maybe those numbers aren't exactly precisely correct, but they speak to like the difference in orders of magnitude in terms of
the order of magnitude it's clear which one is bigger. You can be off by, if you're off by a digit, you're still it
right.
Doesn't even matter.
Right. So we're already getting into the weeds of this industry talk, and we'll continue, but I want to press pause on that because considering Quilty, and obviously Chris Quilty, your founder, started it, but I think you could, speak to it as well as him, why he felt the need to go out and start this shop. And then I also want to ask about what your typical kind of the typical profile of your customers, or we're not talking about technology, otherwise I'd say users, but who you're working with a lot.
Sure. So they run through those as to like kind of the background of the company and why it was founded. So Chris was a financial analyst at Raymond James, spent his time covering space companies, and originally covered a lot of them that got bought up by defense contractors and then eventually just sort of disappeared. Later chose, like about 5 or 6 years ago, to start this company and be dedicated solely to covering space companies, the number of which has more than doubled because of the SPAC boom of the past year or two, and a couple of conventional IPAs that brought companies onto public markets.
IPAs.
Excuse me, IPOs.
Caleb, I'm ready for the weekend too, and it's only Wednesday morning.
That could be the next podcast.
Yes.
IPAs and IPOs.
Yes, that is a great idea. You should trademark that.
I got to run to the patent office. So the goal again for the company was to kind of provide dedicated coverage from a financial lens in a way that wasn't really being done anywhere else. I think you look at other financial firms and they'll maybe have a guy who's covering telecom, and by extension will have 2 or 3 satellite operators. You'll have somebody who's covering defense, and by extension might have a space company. But I think that in my view, was always a problem. Space was not really being given enough attention by itself. It was always being an add-on, a glommed on to something else. And so here, I feel like we are able to give space more the attention than it deserves, and be able to provide more of like a holistic image of the industry itself. Because truthfully, like the space industry is so broad, even within itself, that you can talk to one company at one end of it and they'll have no idea what's going on at the other end. Yeah. So getting that holistic approach, I think has been helpful for me as I learn about the industry, and then it's helpful to share that with our readers as we produce content.
Yeah. I mean, I think that tracks with the impetus or catalyst or sort of thinking and reason behind why Payload exists too. It's more so on the media side. That's not to say, you worked previously at Space News and Via Satellite, and those are great publications. But even still, the amount of and the mainstream newsletters and cable networks have their space reporter or a couple space reporters, but still, there's just so much more going on. It deserves on both sides of the equation, I would say, more dedicated, focused media outlets, and also, equity research shops, especially because of the SPAC boom and subsequent bust. What has that been like? That must be a different experience than covering some of these legacy satellite operators. And I don't mean legacy. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense whatsoever, because a lot of these companies, are established. They have revenue. They have, if not profitability, whereas it's a little bit of a different story for a lot of the SPACs. But it must be kind of different putting on the analyst hat for some of the more established companies or the massive contractors. As you mentioned, there's been tons of consolidation in the industry for those contractors that have big space divisions versus these SPACs.
Yeah, it certainly is. I don't even know how to summarize that in like in a quick answer. I mean, watching the SPAC companies in a way is kind of like watching children. You're like, I don't have kids, but it's like you're watching them grow up, and you're like, oh, this is all, all right. So like, this one is burning through cash. This one is diversifying. This one is acquiring other stuff. This one is opening up credit lines, and you're looking at all of the different ways that they are kind of learning to swim in a sense. I'm mixing metaphors now, but I feel like the range of actions that are being taken by the SPAC companies is really broad. And you're seeing just kind of like a I hate to use the word race because I feel like it's overused in the space industry. But
I try to avoid saying space race whenever I can, at least as it relates to writing for our writing for our core audience, which is space decision makers and people who have heard space race enough times. And they've also heard like it's not rocket science enough times, so we try to avoid that. But I think that's a good point. They're not a monolithic entity. I'm curious, do you have a spreadsheet somewhere where you just like have like for each of these companies, like when they're going to run out of projected, when they're going to run out of runway?
If we do, it's not one that I manage. One of the guys here told me that there's at least one space company that is now like valued at like under $100 million. And they definitely IPO'd well above that. So, like the way that not just space SPACs, but all SPAC stocks have been thrashed has been pretty unkind to the space industry. And I would add that even though the SPAC companies are not a monolith, as we just discussed, I think that oftentimes the way investors are treating them, if you look at their share price, is as a single entity. So it's surprising to me to watch companies that pull in, 8 or 9 figures worth of revenue getting treated the same from a share price perspective as those that are nowhere near that. Like Planet, I think made somewhere around 100 million in their last fiscal year. And that's also, that is a talking point from
from our episode with Kevin Wheel, who's the VP of product there. He's like, we're not all the same. And another thing he pointed to was, Planet's like super low 2% redemption rate, which is, I think that's fair to call out. Before we move on from SPACs, which are just one of my favorite topics, I wanna return to the kid metaphor. I love that because for an industry that is highly secretive, and most, a lot of times that's by necessity, given like the classified nature of a lot of this work. For a lot of these companies that are privately held, it's like having a kid who has like a security clearance and can't talk to you at all about anything. But for the SPACs, they have to open up their books, and they on a quarterly basis, they have to go out to investors and provide this update. So as someone who tracks the industry like yourself, I've appreciated that, if just for no other reason than just being able to like peer inside and look at the books. Do you share that view?
Oh yeah, I do. And I think that the SPAC boom has provided a window into like the new space, like theory of excellence, essentially. You had all these companies that came up, they got VC dollars, they raised A, B, C, D rounds, whatever. And then, now they've gone public, and you get a real peek under the hood, and you get to say, all right, are you doing better than the legacy players? Can you grow as fast as you said you could? And most of the time, the answer to that one's no. But what does it actually look like to be an unconventional company in the space industry? And will you actually deliver, or are you delivering? I think we're finding that the answer, I guess, as with most things in life, it's never just black and white.
Yeah, totally.
They are certainly, I think every SPAC company, or 90% of the space SPAC companies, have fallen short of the projections that they put in their initial SPAC deck. But they have still had a transformative effect on the industry as a whole. They've forced everybody to rethink how they do their business. How can they do it better? How can they fend off competition, or adopt these kind of new practices that are being executed across, whether it's geospatial or launch or what have you.
Yeah.
So I would call it a net positive for the industry.
Yeah. I agree. So do you have, in your day-to-day life, do you ever have interactions or discussions with, obviously you are having these exchanges with institutional type of investors, but do you ever, interact with like retail traders? Because I think that I've enjoyed that. It has, for those who have taken the plunge, can't speak categorically, but it's been a little bit of a bumpy ride, I would imagine, for a lot of investors, smaller investors who, bet on the fortunes of some of these companies, at least in the before times when everything was still super frothy. Do you ever interact with just like everyday, traders, investors?
Generally, no. We don't. We certainly have we follow AST SpaceMobile, and I think that's the one.
They've got a rabid, very, very, very active Reddit and just like internet community.
Oh yeah,
I love that.
So hi Reddit, AST SpaceMobile subreddit. We're reading you.
We definitely are.
I would say in general we don't. A lot of our subscribers. I think when Quilty Analytics was founded, it was about half finance subscribers and half space industry subscribers.
Okay. Yeah.
That mix has actually shifted, where now I'm like ballparking this, but I think we're about 3/4 industry, and then 1/4 the finance types. And I honestly don't know why that is. Maybe Chris could give a better answer. My best guess is that I think the industry clamors for information about itself. Going back to the fact that this is not a monolithic industry, and there's so many pieces of it that are hard to understand, that kind of need their own deep dives. And kind of spinning like that whole web of the industry together. So like, I'll use the metaphor that the industry is like, it stands on a three-legged stool. You have to have launch, you have to have the manufacturer, the spacecraft manufacturer, and you have to have the ground with your antennas and your fiber and all of that, your big dishes that look at the sky or your flat panel antennas. And until you have those three, you can't build anything else. Once you have that base, that's when you have your telecom, you have your LEO constellation, you have your CubeSats, and you have your Earth observation. You've got cislunar going to the moon and Mars. But all of those different parts, they don't always interact with each other. So I think that's why we get people coming to us more so from the space industry than the finance side.
I'm going to make a graphic for your stool, and I will put it in the video version of this podcast, and I'll put it in the show notes too. Time for a short break to hear about our sponsors again. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. SpiderOak Mission Systems builds space cybersecurity solutions for civilian, military, and commercial space operations. Their Orbit Secure protocol delivers zero trust security to zero gravity environments, protecting space communication, command, control, data transmission, storage, and integrity at the data level. To learn more about how zero trust architectures will revolutionize security in new space, download the new NSR SpiderOak sponsored whitepaper titled Space Cybersecurity, Current State and Future Needs. You can find that whitepaper at spacecyber.com. Again, that is spacecyber.com. We love nice and easy to remember URLs. For more info, check out their website at spideroak-ms.com and tell them Pathfinder sent you. I love space metaphors. I know some folks in the industry don't, but if we want more people paying attention to this, we need accessible metaphors. And so that's full stop how I think about this. But what leg of that stool, and I know the answer already, but what leg of that stool do you think is most underappreciated and most underdiscussed, and maybe let's also add like most unsexy, like overlooked?
Yeah, I think you know where I'm going with this one. It's definitely going to be the ground. I mean, come on, rockets, they're literally exploding. Like, it's a controlled explosion, hopefully. Manufacturing, you're building something that's going to space. That's super cool. The antenna, you can talk about an antenna and not at all bring up the subject of space, which can make it frightening at some time, at points. Certainly when I was learning the industry, I was like, a phased array, what? It's still like, as far as I'm concerned, there's just like little gnomes inside of the antenna, and that's what steers the beam. Nobody has properly explained to me how an antenna element works. But yeah, it's the antennas. I think we all know in the industry that it doesn't work without them. In order for consumer broadband to be a success, you have to have cheap antennas. In order to just kind of make anything work, in order to talk to your satellite, when a spacecraft fails, usually what they say is, "Oh, we've lost contact with it." That's the first point of, we have a problem, is we can no longer communicate. Our antennas on the ground are searching for it or trying to link with it. That's an area that honestly has had a lot of really cool development. I think the growth in cloud data storage, cloud computing, the number of teleport operators and satellite operators that have added data centers as part of their offering has really helped stitch satellites into kind of the broader connectivity infrastructure. I think that satellites, and especially satellite communication, which is sort of my wheelhouse, is becoming much, much less isolated. And I would attribute a lot of that to evolution on the ground. I think it's the inclusion of satellite and space in the development of 5G standards. And then there's this wild card of the direct to smartphone connectivity that we were talking about before, where space is no longer going to be this niche thing.
Yeah. And I think I've seen you, and maybe it was in the interview that you did with Ian a couple of months back. I will link to it, but you spoke, and I thought it was pretty poignant, compelling, about the overhead. Maybe overhead's not the right amount of words, or sorry, maybe overhead is not the right exact word. And I'm actually going to take this back to drones, which I used to cover in a past life. I've got like all my drones right here on my desk with me. But like drones, this is happening in that world too, where the ratio of like operators for the more sophisticated stuff is shrinking. And in some cases, it's flipped to where one operator can be overseeing tons of drones in industrial ag, that sort of thing. Can you walk us through what that looks like from the ground for satellites? And I know that there's not one answer that is applicable across the entire industry, but just observations that you see there.
I don't know if I follow the question. Sorry. What do you mean? Like the average person being able to like set up a Starlink terminal or?
Oh, okay. So consumer is interesting, but that is not the root of this sort of question. Is command and control for satellite constellations and what that looks like, and it used to be a like bunker, and now it's like someone can monitor the fleet on their smartphone. Am I completely misremembering or?
No, you got that right. And that's one of the that's a very fun evolution of that whole service. If you ever get a chance to visit like a mission control center for Iridium or Intelsat or whoever, they're really impressive and cool places. But it's equally impressive for somebody to be like, oh, I'm flying a satellite from my phone right now.
I hope they have like a mobile VPN on or something when they're showing you.
Please.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah. I am scared of what I feel like is an eventual headline of some hacker taking over a satellite somewhere, and just kind of using it, flying their own thing as their own ballistic missile. Let's hope that never happens, but I think cyber has become a big concern as well.
Totally.
You could have, if you like the stool metaphor from before, there's another one that I like to think of as the invisible stool. And that one is cyber, spectrum, and space situational awareness. None of those are things that you see, but all of them you have to invest in really heavily and ideally at the front end. Otherwise, your business will also not be able to stand up its own.
Yeah, that's great. I'll make a diagram for that as well. Let's broaden the aperture here a bit and consider, you did just mention that you focus on SATCOM, but you've also said toward the top of the show that y'all do EO, commercial weather, like specific modalities like SAR. What are some of the biggest growth areas, broadly defined, in the satellite industry? And let me at least qualify that with, on orbit, so not manufacturing, and then not launch. I do, I share the view. I love a good launch as much as the next space nerd, but to your point, and to part of like the reason that we started Payload, and I think why we've seen some early signs of traction and success, is there's just so much more going on. So biggest growth areas for the satellite industry, or on conversely, areas that you see as being more so in relative or like secular decline.
Sure. So I would highlight 3 growth areas. I don't think these will be super surprising, but the first on the communication side, it's going to be internet. If you look at kind of your traditional satellite operator, their broadcast television business is stable to declining. That's like really lucrative, makes a lot of money, is not super intense, but it's in decline.
Yeah.
Whereas internet is fast growing, but it's also much more intense from an operator perspective. They have to provide more managed services. They have to get closer to the customer with providing network services and all these things. And so basically there's a lot more touch points. There's a lot more software that goes into it. And that makes
not to interrupt, but if you're a D2C direct to consumer, like Starlink, like you have to have customer service. Like they had an outage the other night, and SpaceX doesn't really talk to the press, but like they have to talk to the customer. And so obviously, the messages about resolving customer support tickets and everything are propagated widely on the internet and in news headlines. So yeah, there's a lot more complexities. I think that's a good point to highlight.
Yeah. So it's fast growing, but it's a more difficult business. And that's what's given the industry, that has contributed to the existential crisis that the SATCOM sector has had.
Yeah.
Besides choosing the right orbit and whatnot.
Oh gosh, we could do like a 10 podcast series about this, not just this one topic.
Yeah, it could be a whole series. On the Earth observation side, I think that what's most interesting is, I would call it data fusion, just the merger of different phenomenologies, whether it's your classic optical or it's SAR or even radio frequency mapping. Being able to blend these things together, and for example, SAR is really good at picking out boats in the water. You might pick it up on a SAR satellite, or you might maybe a radio frequency satellite will pick it up first because the transponder, the IS transponder went off. We picked it up using Hawkeye 360. We found it again using Capella, and then we got an actual picture of it using Black Sky or Planet or somebody.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can bring all of these things together and get like a holistic picture, really cool on the geospatial side. And then on the cislunar side of things, I think the fact that you've got emerging commercial space stations, that there seems to be more momentum than ever before to led by NASA, but through like the CLIPS program and things like that. Very serious discussions about businesses on or around the moon or in a cislunar environment that are where the function is not necessarily coming back down to Earth, taking pictures of Earth, providing comms to Earth, but doing things in space. I feel like we're on the precipice of seeing that become a reality, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that some of our alumni of Pathfinder, including the CEOs of Axiom and Sierra, would also share that view. What are some of the largest, or maybe you can just say one, risk factors that you see for the satellite industry in the near-term future? It's a big question. And it's not one size fits all, but I suppose, this could be anything from, and now I'm leading you on, but like, congestion, debris, that sort of thing, to also just market conditions and R word, recession, that sort of thing. Are there any that you really are thinking a lot about these days?
So in terms of risks, I do think it goes back to that like invisible stool that I mentioned.
Yes. We're going to put it back on screen.
Yeah. I wish I could make it like the invisible boatmobile. If I had like a fourth thing, it'd be like the wheels, the invisible boatmobile. So yeah, space debris. I mean, if you look at like just Starlink alone, and I know that they're the ones that get picked on the most, but like Starlink has basically doubled the number of spacecraft in orbit.
Yeah.
In like a few years. So the on-orbit population has grown faster in the past 2 years than it has for all of human history. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I hope that as a civilization that we manage our assets and things that we put in space well. We didn't do it at the beginning. That's why we've got a bunch of spent rocket stages up there.
Shout out US and Soviet Union.
yeah, go us. We hopefully we'll clean it up and be proud of ourselves for that. But space debris is a big one. Cyber, again, everything's great until it isn't.
Yeah.
And so I really hope that companies are investing well in that to just prevent kind of disasters that would be really unprecedented. And then the third would be spectrum.
Yes.
And that, I feel
You're in my mind. I was about to ask about that.
That's like where all of like, the most bitter industry fights are over spectrum. And man, if you came to me like 10 years ago and are like, oh, you like space? Guess what you're going to spend a lot of time reading about? Would not have guessed it.
Man,
and
Caleb,
for it to be like, the most.
This hits way too close to home.
I've spent, a frightening portion of my life now reading FCC filings.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's a whole thing. But your business has to start with Spectrum. It starts and ends with it. So it's the lifeblood of the industry.
When you do that though, you're ahead of the 8 ball. SpaceX filed for Dish. I'm gonna mess this up on air, but they filed for the 2 or 1.9 gigahertz that like Dish currently has like a month ago, almost exactly a month ago. Will be over a month by the time we air this, but it was pretty overtly gave a nod to the fact that they were going to make a mobile play soon. So it is, I feel you, and the amount of hours that we've collectively lost, and not just us, lots of friends and coworkers, but it's fascinating. I mean, have you ever seen that map of like spectrum allocation in the US? I'll also put that up. It is a crazy map. It's like all these different little colors and like bands.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's funny because like we will write like an explainer into the latest, lawsuit or like FCC filing about companies beefing over spectrum, and like some of those have been our most popular posts. Like one of them was like on the top of Hacker News. So you never know. Spectrum is a key part of the invisible stool. So two larger thematic questions, and then we'll close out the substantive part of the show. And I mean, there's just so much more that we could talk about, but I want to be mindful of your time and the audience's time. But the first is launch and where you think there's room to grow. And maybe let's bracket this out by class of rockets or, payload capability, and where it's like satiated or even oversupplied. And then the second one is just to say a bit on the initial and ongoing impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because y'all put out a really, really great report, which I will also link to in the show notes. But that was super instructive for me, and just deciphering how these ripple effects played out across the entire industry. So launch, and then Russia and Ukraine.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the shout out there. On launch, I really feel like our perspective has changed, or my perspective has certainly changed just in the past 6 months. And that has entirely to do with Amazon.
Caleb, I gotta stop you there. What was that like? You moderated that announcement, which was this massive industry announcement, right? You were there at Space Symposium, like talking with all the CEOs. Were you nervous?
I'm always nervous before moderating any event.
You did a great job. You did a great job.
I appreciate that. There's a pro tip for public speakers. The piece of advice that resonated with me the best was that you'll always have butterflies in your stomach. The goal is not to make them go away; it's to make them fly in unison. And that's what I tell myself whenever I'm going to go and do something. I'm like, just need you all to fly in unison. Right?
I think
let's just be a unit.
I think that might be better than like the classic one, or maybe it's not the classic one, but the one that I always think of, which is just imagine the room naked. I like the butterfly one's much more elegant than the naked audience.
There you go. Yeah, you won't be like visibly grimacing on stage. But so yeah, that was great. I mean, it was the CEOs of Arianespace, Blue Origin, and ULA, getting to talk about the role that they were going to play there, and really just kind of how transformative it was going to be. I mean, you saw ULA is like building out full new launch infrastructure. Arianespace is doing an upgrade of their rocket to be able to support, like they're practically redesigning the rocket for that mission. And for Blue Origin, it gives them an anchored customer, which I think is something they sorely needed, especially after getting dropped out of the national security space launch competition. So in every sense, like to the fullest extent possible, like it validated the business for all three of those players. So that was huge. And then for a broader industry perspective, two big ripple effects. The first is that they have vacuumed up so much launch capacity that I think that we could actually enter a phase where launch is in short supply. We will see. Don't hold me to that yet. Starship is coming. H3 is coming. Relativity is coming. There's going to be a lot more vehicles that are coming up in the heavy lift domain, let alone small launch. So there will be more capacity, and we'll see what role that plays. I also think that this was a pretty telling moment for the small launch community. Something that I have tweeted out a few times because it's a real conviction of mine is that you see a lot of small launch companies talking about how they're going to serve the mega constellation market. And to date, they're not. Nobody is launching.
There's still hope for like replenishment, right? But not for being, launching like the core constellation.
Yeah. I mean, if you count misses and withdrawals. So, Virgin Orbit was originally supposed to launch like 39 missions for OneWeb, going up to 100. Then it was reduced to 4. And now I don't even know if it's any. Iridium was supposed to launch up to 6 missions with Relativity. Now it's maybe 1 spare satellite, hopefully. Starlink, obviously not launching on small rockets. Kuiper, not on small rockets. Telesat has a sort of a vague deal with Relativity that's never been fleshed out. It's really a struggle to see how they're going to fit in there or how they're going to make a business plan around spot filling satellites, especially when a selling point of constellations is supposed to be their redundancy, their safety in numbers. So I think for that subset of the launch industry, they really need to do some soul searching and figure out how to either A, effectively court the mega constellations, or B, pivot. But if they think that, if you put these figures up of thousands of satellites launching and you just need a portion of it, well, no, you've got to cleave off like more than half and just say, we're barely going to touch that.
Yeah.
And then look at your market share and ask, is this sufficient to run forward with a business, especially one that may need a high launch cadence to be healthy?
It's always an interesting intellectual exercise to go back and look at the financial projections and the investor decks for a lot of these companies that were going public through SPACs, and just how the business case was sort of predicated on a cadence of launches that is unimaginable today.
Your last question, or your other question about the Russia-Ukraine, that was, it was a sad report to do, but it has to be probably like top 3 most interesting that we've done. Because we basically looked at every touch point that we knew of, we could find to Russia or Ukraine. And I think most people sleep on the fact that Ukraine is like a rocketry powerhouse.
Like Dnipro, right? Like that. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation.
Yeah, I think it's Dnipro.
Oh boy,
is the town.
Apologies.
Same for the rocket, the old Dnieper rocket that's been since discontinued. But Ukraine was the country that exported. The U.S. doesn't export rockets. Russia and Ukraine did, and I think Ukraine's impact is arguably more felt. They shipped rockets or engines to the U.S. They shipped engines to Europe. I believe they were they either did or were in discussions to ship engines to Asia, to at least one country in Asia. So the ramifications there, minimum hit 3 continents. I think it's now fairly public news that OneWeb's supplier for their thrusters is in Russia. Now what we're doing, I think it would be interesting to do another report a year later, and look at how the holes have been filled. I think you're seeing with Northrop Grumman partnering with Firefly.
Shout out to they're based in Austin.
Yeah, and you're in Austin. Yeah,
two space startup. Yeah, I love it.
So
near Austin, that's right.
Yeah, I would say that's the thing that I'm watching now is, I think in that report, we identified several pain points and several possible pain points that the industry was going to have to deal with. And at the time, we didn't know if this was going to be a 1-month thing or an indefinite thing. We're seeing that whole conflict drag on, and the industry is having to learn how to move without it. So I'm really curious if the recent deal that Astra struck to supply engines to Airbus, OneWeb satellites. If that's actually going to go on the OneWeb constellation, or if it's going to be for some other program, maybe that is plugging that hole, now that they don't have a Russian supplier.
Yeah.
But yeah, super interesting. Really sad to see what it's doing to the Russian space industry. I think that space has been a really cool story of kind of the coming together of two enemies. It's like the iconic story. You've got the Apollo Soyuz docking and all this great history, and now we're seeing these two powerhouse countries turn away from each other, and the split that is literally tearing rockets in half and tearing satellites in half, and just creating a lot of difficulty.
Yeah, I say space is definitely losing its sort of safe haven status. So I think that it's essential that we talk about that, but I'm going to move us right along to brighter pastures. Let's get to the close of show questions. These are the more rapid fire ones, more fun, palate cleansers. All right. And I think you've already spoken to a lot of, my boilerplate standard one, which is like hottest take, most contrarian view. I think we've also hit on most overhyped and underhyped aspects of space. So I'm going to skip to the sci-fi section and ask, are you a big sci-fi fan? Second part of that question, what are the seminal works according to Caleb Henry? And then 3, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh boy. Okay. So I'll try to answer this in order. Am I a sci-fi fan? Yes, very much so. I've always been fascinated with sci-fi. I tend to lean towards things that are more, more realistic sci-fi, if you can call it that. Like, I want it to be more heavy on the science than the fiction. So, don't just disrespect every rule in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Use creative license, but make sure that you can actually keep the science as the adjective. Sorry, what was your second question? What are my big things?
Yeah.
Things that I like.
Favorite.
I'm a huge Arthur C. Clarke fan.
Great answer.
So I've read a lot of his books. H.G. Wells as well. So Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man. Those are some classics. Movies, Interstellar, The Martian. I'm pretty basic, I guess, when it comes to the industry and space movies.
Do you like do you watch / For All Mankind? We are massive fans of that show.
I have not. It's on my list. I know I need to give that one a try.
Yeah. For being an alternate reality show and being premised upon this whole counterfactual of Soviets landing on the moon first, I think it does a pretty good job of touching on big historical moments and then also sticking somewhat close to the science. But if people disagree, feel free to write in and let me know. Last question, just your light Wednesday morning question: are we alone in the universe?
I really doubt it. So I'm actually one of the books I'm reading. Where did I put it? I wish I could see the title. I cannot. But it's about that very thing. It's about the search for extraterrestrial life and kind of why we haven't found it or encountered it. My short answer is I definitely no doubt there is life in the universe. Whether or not there's intelligent life, on the level of humanity or beyond, that I do feel is an open question. And I wonder, I think that, civilization ending events are probably harder to avoid than we would hope. I think humanity has, so what, if the earth is 4 billion years old, humanity has been here for 100,000 or you're asking the wrong person, but
no, it's like a good metaphor is it's if you mapped it out as distance, it's like the distance from LA to New York is how long it's existed, and then one city block in Manhattan is the amount of time we've been here.
Yeah, and then we already made the nuke and have been living under the threat of will we destroy ourselves as a whole? So how long do civilizations exist under that shroud? Does every civilization reach the point where they realize that they could destroy themselves entirely and then they have to hold off from that. Like I'm wondering if that's like an inflection point where like maybe, and sorry, I know you wanted to end on a happy note, but I wonder if like species, like this is just the chronic, like, sure, life can evolve, but like it's never smart enough to like actually like perpetuate, beyond like self-destructive tendencies.
Yeah.
I hope that the universe is better than that.
Yeah, me too.
But
or we're all just in a simulation. So who knows?
Or that, yeah.
Who knows? Well, Caleb, we'll have to do a IPAs and IPOs part 2 soon, whenever IPOs come back. So maybe it won't be too soon, but thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been great.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks for having me.
All right, that will do it for Pathfinder 0016, folks. Thanks to Caleb for coming on and for the time, but more importantly, thanks for the new mental models or frameworks, if you will, for dealing with the nerves. You just got to channel the butterflies in your tummy. If you want to go deeper, be sure to check out the show notes for links to some of Quilty's research and Caleb's writing. As always, Pathfinder is brought to you by Payload, a modern space media brand, and while we have designs of becoming the biggest space content company in the galaxy, for now, we put out Payload, our flagship daily newsletter, Monday through Friday, Pathfinder once a week, and Parallax, our brand spanking new weekly science newsletter for the space industry. Subscribe now so you can say you were early by signing up at parallax.beehive.com. Beehive is BEEHIIV. I will also put that link in the show notes. We have a few more Pathfinder in Petty episode tapings coming up that I think you're really going to love, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I am Ryan Duffy signing off, and I'll see you back here next week.